Well, mine doesn't do that. So at this point, I am convinced I am not escaping the gacha story arc. What started as an innocent dabble into a game genre I have not tried before, turned into diving into new universes and burning energy to get resources on daily basis. And we keep on with the grind because Hoyoverse keeps sponsoring these videos. That's right, for legal reasons we have to confirm that this video is indeed sponsored by Zenless Zone Zero. However, that does not mean I will not be critical where it's fair. Because while Zenless does push the boundaries of presentations in many ways, and there are some really good reasons for this game to feel different from all their other titles, there are also some parts that could be improved. And so, let's talk about what kind of a new universe Hoyoverse introduced, and let's investigate just why does it feel different. Zenless Zone Zero took me by surprise for a big reason. Combat-wise, it is very different from something like Genshin. Presentation-wise, it is very different from Star Rail. And story-wise, it seems to be something entirely unique for Hoyoverse. And that's because Zenless is specifically targeting its own new audience. Now, what kind of an audience that is? You'll see later. Before that, let's segment this video into thematic parts, and let's start with the story. The world of Zenless Zone Zero is surprisingly close to real life. If anything, this is as much of an anime as a game can get. You start by choosing your main character, which as far as I know does not really matter, and that's simply because in this game, unlike it is in Genshin or Star Rail, both of them take part in the story and they both take on an entirely unique character. Which means they are both present at all times, and what you're really choosing is what character you control when you do your daily tasks. After this, you are thrown into what feels to be just a modern eastern city. But it's all plagued with the Hollows, which are anomalies that are spewing out monsters known as Eternals. And just to make things a little bit more interesting, it also acts as a plague infecting mortal beings. And that is pretty much it for the setup of the story. From that point on, everything is carried by the setup of the two main characters. They are siblings that run a movie store, which is something very unusual to see in 2024. But of course, because the story is set up to be as anime as possible, while they are running their own store, in secret they are also working together as a proxy. With a proxy essentially being a hacker or a netrunner, which you might recognize from some other sci-fi fantasy universes. In fact, the more you dig into this, the more you might notice some similarities and inspirations from the original book version of the cyberpunk universe. And in many ways, the story will stay around a similar theme. You are someone who's completing commissions for their clients, which can be anything from infiltrating bases to collecting personal data to taking down important personnel. And because you are not really a fighter, it is all done by navigating your agents to complete the tasks. The strong side of this kind of a story is that it is very different from what you might have experienced before. It definitely seems to be inspired by the cyberpunk vibes, maybe with a bit of a sprinkle from the Persona presentation. And if you are into that thematic, you're gonna love the secret agent vibes. However, the one problem the story has right now is that it takes a while for it to ramp up. In comparison to Star Rail, where they really nailed the pace from the very beginning, here it really takes a while before you find any kind of a meaningful threat. It really does start like you start as a nobody and you are building up your reputation. Which is what's actually happening, and in a way it is awesome to see that, but I believe in Zenless Zone Zero it takes a little bit too long. And it is all tied to the fact that the progression also takes a while to unlock. By which I don't really mean that people would like to rush to the endgame. No, I'm talking about simply unlocking basic features. Like farming your artifacts, which is what gacha games always do. Just unlocking those takes longer than is expected. Though there might be a reason why they are doing this, because normally in a gacha game you don't want to farm your artifacts until you are a certain level, because you are only getting the lesser versions of those artifacts. So instead, Zenless just unlocks it later so you don't waste your energy. It is a bit of an odd design decision, but I can see why it works. That said, back to the story, as I said, Zenless has a very unique way to go through it. Mostly it is done through 4 different mediums: the comics, the conversations, the animations, and the TVs. The comics work really well. They are a quick and easy way to tell a story using just a bunch of images and popping up text. They are usually reserved for the beginning of storylines or bigger points to make simple exposition as entertaining as possible. And at that, it is pretty good. It honestly works so much better than characters simply telling you what's happening. Speaking of which, of course there are also the conversations. These are the Hoyoverse staples. Just a bunch of characters standing next to each other as they engage in story talk, while they sometimes move using a shared library of animations. But here, Zenless does it differently. Instead of just standing at a location, given how the open world of this game works, they wouldn't have enough unique locations built. So the game is utilizing more of a presentation style for their conversations. The characters simply pop up on screen with the background rarely being meaningful. Now here, one could say, that is a really cheap way to do conversations. But you would actually be wrong here. It is true that characters simply popping up like they are puppets may seem like it is on a lower budget. But as I mentioned, it's because Zenless Zone Zero doesn't have the open world with the pre-built scenes to utilize. So, to counteract on that, they gave all characters unique speaking animations. This is something neither Genshin nor Star Rail has. There, all the characters have one of 4 different skeletons, all of which shares the exact same animations. Here, when one character uses their surprised animation or a simple idle standing animation, it is entirely different from anyone else. And by doing this, Zenless is able to portray so much more emotion during their conversations. This is perhaps the strongest part of the storytelling. Even though the story itself may not be for everyone, their presentation combined with the ridiculously good voice acting can make the scenes pop.
Let's see. A flashlight, old magazine, broken ashtray. Huh? Ew! Smelly socks! Gross! Ugh, what on earth do these gangsters leave in their hideout?
Haha! Found it!
What'd you find? Nekomata's family heirloom?
Maybe. If her family heirloom is the most amazingly awesome, epic, shiny Starlight Knight emblem of the last 10 years!
And speaking of making scenes pop, they also have their animated cutscenes. And these are the most ridiculous, over-the-top, expressive animations I have ever seen. These play whenever a big moment is happening in a story. Though sometimes they are also used for the smaller scenes just to tie the story bits together. And in my opinion, these are the best way to tell a story in this game. I really mean it, I have never seen animation feel so lively. And it doesn't matter if it is an action scene or if it is just 2 characters having the most ordinary conversation you can have. These animations just give me so much joy. I mean, really, look at this short clip of the 2 main characters simply talking about restocking their store.
So, I did a pretty good job of recording, right?
Isn't this just footage of the rescue operation?
So what? It's got a factual basis, just like a documentary, with a shaky camera and Barry's editing. It combines exciting battles with an emotional rescue operation.
This is wild. Their animations could make dripping sap interesting if they wanted to. But that leaves us with the last part of storytelling that is actually tied to gameplay. And that are the TVs. We'll talk about the gameplay side of these in detail in just a moment. For now, just know that during these missions, you move around the TVs like it's a board game. When you step on specific tiles, you can trigger specific events. And sometimes those events can have story sequences. And sometimes it can also be just a combat tile that throws you into the combat gameplay. Now, if you have snooped around the internet, you might have noticed that people are pretty split on this feature. There are some people that would like to skip this and just stick to the pure combat side, but there are also others who like the TV gameplay. Personally, I think they are totally fine because they also add 2 new features to this game. First of all, it is obvious that these TVs are a setup for the roguelike simulated universe gameplay, because later the TVs are reused exactly for that. But also, interestingly enough, the TVs flawlessly weave into the storytelling. Many people don't realize this, but with your main role being the proxy, or in other words, a hacker, you watching these TVs is the POV of the proxy. This is how you're watching the missions happen in front of you as you are navigating your agents. And oftentimes the game is using unique TVs with unique effects to set up the stories. In some, you have to take over a train. And so, bunch of TVs with actual train tracks and the trains pop up. In other missions, you might be getting bombed. And so you have to dodge TVs with actual bombs on them. Honestly, I think people are underestimating just how well the TVs can work to tie gameplay into story. The issue is that it is just not gameplay for everyone. If you came into this game just expecting bunch of combat, you're gonna be surprised that this is a lot closer to a puzzle game. And even though it is a puzzle game with RPG elements, it is very different from Genshin or Star Rail. So overall, the TVs work quite well, and their module design makes it so that the devs can go wild with them. But for now, I understand that if some people don't like them, it is because they are for a very specific audience. Now, with these 4 story tools covered, we should mention that given how niche the storyline is, Hoyoverse knew it wouldn't be a story for everyone, which is why they also gave us the story skip button. So if you're not a fan of the story, you can just skip it and go for the combat. That said, to show us that they are not just giving up on the story, they also introduced the story library, which allows you to replay any scene and any conversation from any of the stories. And that is honestly wild. Now, as I mentioned, some of the story tools are linked to gameplay, so now let's talk about gameplay. For the most part, the gameplay is divided into 2 parts, the combat and the TVs. The combat itself is honestly pretty good. At first, the chances are, even after going through the tutorial, you will have no idea what's happening. And whenever an assist is triggered, you'll just be mashing buttons to see if anything cool happens. And the truth is, something cool will happen. If anything, the combat in ZZZ is flashy. And once you start putting some thought behind what you are doing, it can feel very satisfying. Essentially, we are talking about a hack-and-slash styled combat, where you can break the enemy's guard to stun them, which triggers an assist. In this step, you can choose which character you want to step in with a special attack, and if they override the stun with an attack of a different element, they can chain in another assist. And that is how you can get these crazy long chains of your entire team jumping into the fight. What's cool about this is that you can easily trigger these even if you have no idea what you are doing. However, that can also be seen as a bad thing because at times it may feel like you are just button mashing. But that's mostly at the beginning, where the content is really a pushover. The longer you push into the game, the more challenging the content will get. Now, I haven't gotten to the very end yet, so I don't know what will face you there. I've heard rumors that things are not that difficult, though that also correlates to how much you spent on the game. It is a gacha game after all. But roughly in the middle of the game, you'll start seeing some boss fights with mechanics that actually matter. Not to mention that later in the game, you also unlock a hard mode for most of the fights for those of you who would like to pay attention during your fighting. And of course, Zenless is also getting the classic bi-weekly challenge mode that rewards you with pulls. This kind of a challenge progression worked really well in their other games, and so I'm glad to see it's making a comeback here. Now of course, since the combat in a mission-styled game would only carry you so far, Hoyoverse decided to fill the game with TVs. So, let's talk about those. When you are doing all the story missions, moving around the board and doing the story tasks can be cool. And the story is doing its best to keep it interesting. But eventually you will start to feel its repetitive side, which is where the roguelike game mode of this game kicks in. In Zenless it is called Hollow Zero, the place that is believed to be the source of all the anomalies. In this game mode you are using the TVs to explore maps, get random augments similar to what you can see in Star Rail, which can also fuse if you have multiple of one kind of an augment. You can walk into randomized rooms with randomized events, you have your combat encounters, you have your boss encounters, and honestly, this is where the TVs shine. This is very obviously why the TVs were put into the game. Their main purpose was not to use them for storytelling. That is honestly just the devs being clever. No, it is this roguelike game mode, which is basically a game within a game. In its current iteration, it is decent. It has its own progression system where you get currencies by completing runs, after which you can buy permanent upgrades, so you can take on harder and harder rooms, and it kinda feels like the second iteration of the simulated universe we got in Star Rail, which, let me tell you, is really popular. And that is why I have no doubt Zenless will iterate on this too. I mean, Star Rail did exactly the same thing. Some of you may not remember this, but when this game launched, people quickly cleared all the content and they had nothing to do. Then they came out with more of an endless version of the simulated universe, and that is where people really got to test out their teams. In Zenless, it really seems like Hoyoverse is aiming to do the same thing. It is, in my opinion, the best part of the game, and we are one iteration away from getting something amazing. So, overall, if you are not a fan of the TVs in the story, it will honestly get better later. It just sucks that it comes later. Now, since we are talking about gameplay, there is one more thing I have to mention, and that is the arcade minigames. Yes, these are just some quick fun which you can play single player or against other players. And by doing this, you can unlock a bunch of achievements which essentially give you more pulls. But speaking of achievements, let's now dive into the progression. In many ways, this is a staple of Hoyoverse games. And so, you know exactly what to expect. You get your characters, whom you have to level up. You level up their abilities, you level up their weapons, which in this game are called cores. And you ascend them all to get them to even higher levels. Of course, you hop into simulated combat rooms to farm the materials for this, and that is your core gameplay progression loop. Though for some, the progression loop will be farming pulls for their characters. And that is where things get interesting. To get pulls, you can find chests in random places around the open world. You can progress the bi-weekly challenge and see how far you can get. You get pulls for doing the roguelike game mode. You get a bunch of pulls from all kinds of achievements. There are a lot of side quests and combat quests. Every day you can walk to the dog stand and read some newspapers about what's happening in the world, as well as do a scratch-off gacha. The arcade minigames give you more pulls. And of course, it is Hoyoverse, so events also give you more pulls. Now of course, if you wanna wail out, none of this may matter to you. Which is also where Zenless introduced a second gacha into the game, but this one is entirely free. And that of course is pulling for bang boos. The bang boos are very complex, but they are pretty much the mascot of this universe. That's right. Besides just the 3 people on your team, you can also add in 1 assist bang boo, whom you can get from a gacha system for which you pay with an entirely free-to-play currency. As far as I know, you can't buy this one, and it functions exactly like a normal pull system. And with that said, it is time to get into the final part of this video. The presentation. If there is one thing this game absolutely nails down, it is the presentation of its universe and its characters. From the wacky animations, to the world design, to the graphic style, to all the details. It all makes sense as one uniform puzzle. Puzzle that serves its own audience. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an audience of adults. Now, hear me out. It is obvious that this game is meant for a more mature audience because from the very beginning, the story starts with a bunch of swearing and then they drop Nicole on top of your head. Now, in a gacha game, it is no secret that the devs are trying to make their characters attractive for the sake of appeal. But so far, and I know it's funny that I'm even saying this, Hoyoverse has always been very tame with the way they present their characters. Sure, in their other games, some characters on the design perspective might be more loaded than others, but when you talk to them, you'll see they are just a normal character with their own problems. They are just who they are for the sake of being who they are. And they just leave their design just sitting there and never mention it. Of course, there are some exceptions, but here, Zenless actually leans into it a little bit. And Nicole is the best example. You see, when it comes to character animations, they are always an extension of the character you are animating. When they have more springy animations, they might be more quirky. And when they have more snappy animations, they might be a stronger character. And when you make the animations of a character so it makes a perfect box around their chest, that is a sign you embrace your audience. And I'm not gonna lie, Zenless is doing it in a really cool way. Because even on the design front, believe it or not, it actually makes sense. With the way their animations are extremely expressive, with their facial animations specifically being all about stretch and squish, jiggle physics actually enhance the animations. It is extremely cohesive with the entire graphic style. And I'll be honest, I have never seen a company that made that part of their identity and did it well. This is an achievement and a half. I mean, we don't even have to talk about the wolf guy, do we? When you have a look at the 6 guaranteed S ranks you get in this game, 5 of them are ladies, 1 of them is a wolf. Which means in this game, either you are looking forward to your next waifu, or you're leaning to be a furry. And I am not a furry.
I have no idea from the animation. I have no idea.
Attendant Lycon, at your service.
I am not a furry!
And that is pretty much Zenless Zone Zero in a nutshell for you. A game with extremely good animations, a very different take on storytelling, a decently flashy combat, and a massive potential for a really good roguelike game mode in the future. For me, if there is something that took me by surprise, it is that everything is interactive. From the coffee shop to the noodle shop, to reading the newspapers that show you what happened in the story, to reading the internet posts that also reflect on what's happening, to trying to spin every object in the game. Because people don't realize, when the game shows one of these props on the screen, it is actually a 3D object you can inspect. And yes, even the cores are fully 3D and fully animated. I have to admit, I spent way too much time just looking at these because they look so cool. But sometimes these immersive elements in the game also reveal something scary. Sometimes they reveal something you might not wanna see.